Part 1. The Beginning, Fear, and the Instinct of Acting. Many viewers see Lord of the Mysteries only as a spectacular leveling journey of a future god. But if we only look at the potions and the battles, we miss the most essential element. How does an ordinary office worker not go insane within his first week of transmigration? It all began not with a bang, but with a terrifying silence. In a dark room in Tianjin, a young man woke up with a bullet hole in his temple, yet his mind remained intact. That was Zhou Mingrui, or, as he is known now, Klein Moretti. Imagine waking up one morning with no computer, no internet, and no familiar food. In their place are oil lamps, steam, and maddening whispers echoing from the void. Zhou Mingrui did not feel the excitement typical of isekai protagonists. He felt sheer terror. His only goal at that time was not to become a god, but to find a way back home. The Tarot Club, the powerful secret organization of the future, was actually just a desperate attempt to seek help. Beneath the cloak of the great Mr. Fool, there was actually a lonely, trembling soul trying to hide his weakness from strangers. Klein Moretti's strength lies not just in the gray, above the gray, or transcendent sequences, but in an extremely sophisticated psychological defense system. To understand a god, we must first deconstruct the fragments of a human being placed in a state of absolute survival. Let's dive deep into Klein's psychological source code to see the crisis and the efforts to cling to humanity from the very beginning. First is the identity crisis. In psychology, personal identity is built on memory and social environment. Upon transmigrating, Zhou Mingrui was completely severed from both. This led to a fragmentation of the self. He looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. This is a state of dissociation. He had to force himself to react to the name Klein, but in his consciousness, he was still Zhou Mingrui. This conflict created immense mental pressure. If he lived as Klein, he would lose himself. If he lived as Zhou Mingrui, he would be considered mad or eliminated by the churches. Furthermore, there is the imposter syndrome. Sitting above the gray fog and acting as the fool, Klein lived in constant fear of being exposed. Growth here is not about gaining power, but the ability to endure loneliness when he cannot share his true identity with anyone, even those he loves most, like Benson or Melissa. To adapt and not go mad in a world filled with spiritual pollution, Klein used classic psychological defense mechanisms. First is compartmentalization. Klein completely separated his roles. As Klein, he was the warm, younger brother. As the fool, he was the cold deity. Dividing his personality helped protect the human part within from the overwhelming pressure of the supernatural world. Next is anchoring. Klein clung to old habits, like craving home-cooked food, meticulously counting gold pounds, and worrying about Melissa's education. These mundane things served as psychological anchors, preventing him from being swept away by the grand but empty divinity. Finally, projection. Being weak and insecure, he projected an image of power, the fool, onto the gray fog. He used mystery to compensate for his lack of knowledge about the new world. This displacement was a deep psychological black hole, but life would not allow Zhou Mingrui to remain an outsider forever. Part 2. Tianjin, the shattering of innocence and the Nighthawk's tragedy. From the timid steps of an imposter trying to survive, he began to be drawn into the whirlpool of reality in Tianjin City. If the first phase was a struggle to survive, Tianjin was where Klein found a reason to live. Here, he was no longer alone. He had Benson and Melissa, family members he truly opened his heart to. He had the Nighthawks team, with a strict but tolerant Dunn Smith and a wise but tragic old Neil. For the first time since transmigrating, Klein felt he belonged to this world. He began to dream of a peaceful life, advancing in the church, taking care of his sister, and enjoying afternoon coffee with teammates. But Lord of the Mysteries is not a fairy tale. The tragic event in Tingen, the death of Dunn Smith, and the sacrifice of the Nighthawks was a fatal blow that shattered that illusion. The moment Klein stood before his captain's body and saw Dunn's final, peaceful smile, a part of Zhou Mingrui's soul truly died. When he crawled out of his own grave under the pouring rain, that young man no longer saw the world through the lens of a tourist. He had become a seeker of vengeance, a silent guardian in the shadows. Why did Dunn Smith's death change Klein so drastically? Usually, a protagonist grows stronger after loss, but for Klein, it was a total psychological restructuring. The sacrifice of his predecessors forced him to choose, either continue running from fate or shoulder it. To understand the motivation that drove Klein into extreme danger later on, we need to analyze the psychological darkness born from that very grave in Tingen. First is social bonding and the need for belonging. Humans are social animals. To maintain sanity, Klein needed anchor points. Family and the Nighthawks were not just responsibilities, they were humanity anchors, keeping his mind from being swallowed by Divinity. This was also when the shift in self occurred. He no longer protected Melissa because she was the sister of the real Klein Moretti, but because he truly loved her. The identities of Zhou Mingrui and Klein began to merge into one. Next is survivor's guilt. This is the ghost that followed Klein for many volumes. He fell into a torment of weakness, blaming himself for not being strong enough or fast enough to save Dunn Smith. He felt his life was borrowed from the sacrifice of others. However, he used the mechanism of sublimation, transforming negative emotions into actions beneficial to society. Klein chose to move forward not out of an ambition for power, but because he wanted to fulfill a last wish. We are saving others, not ourselves. Finally, the collapse of the safe world view. Tingen was the first and cruelest lesson about the nature of the supernatural world, madness and loss of control. This is the process of trauma-informed growth. Klein realized that knowledge is a curse. He no longer sought power to go home, but to ensure that the tragedy of Tingen would never happen again to those he loved. The rain at the Tingen cemetery washed away his final innocence, leaving a hollow void in the young man's heart. To protect what remained and find the truth behind the curtain of fog, Klein was forced to leave his old identity and his loved ones behind to head to Backlund, the city of hope and corruption. Here, his journey of growth was no longer measured by tears, but by the number of masks he wore every day. Part 3. Backlund and the Ocean. Masks and dissociative personalities. Backlund appeared with thick smog and cruel conspiracies. Here, the identity of Klein Moretti was dead. In its place was the elegant detective Sherlock Moriarty, and later Gehrman Sparrow, the nightmare of every pirate on the ocean. Paradoxically, as Klein's power grew, he had to live more like a ghost. Gehrman Sparrow was a mad, cold, ruthless killer. The audience sees an invincible bounty hunter, but few see the Klein Moretti cowering inside that iron shell. He dared not make friends, dared not love, even dared not laugh too much. Because in this world, care is a weakness, and emotion is the gap through which madness creeps in. On the vast ocean, amidst life and death battles with mythical creatures, Klein gradually realized a grim truth. To digest the potion, he must act. He had to become the person he was pretending to be. The boundary between an upright detective, a cold-blooded hunter, and a modern soul began to blur. The question, "Who am I?" was no longer just a simple identity crisis, but a struggle for survival to retain the last bit of humanity before turning into a true monster. How could a naturally kind person perfectly embody a cold-blooded killer like Gehrman Sparrow? This isn't just acting skills, it's a high-level psychological survival strategy. Dissociative identity as defense. Klein used acting as a compartmentalization mechanism. Gehrman Sparrow served as the shadow in Jungian psychology, representing the dark parts and killer instincts Klein had to release to survive. The more successful he was as Sparrow, the more Klein felt disgusted with himself. Growth here is the ability to accept one's shadow without losing core moral principles. During this period, he also faced depersonalization. When acting too much, Klein clung to mundane anchors. Eating well or counting money wasn't greed, but sensory anchors that made him feel like a human being. The Tarot Club at this time was both a burden and the reason he wasn't allowed to fall. Finally, voluntary isolation. He proactively pushed people away, realizing that love is sometimes a weapon of the enemy. He chose loneliness to protect others, an expression of noble but tragic altruism. But no matter how sophisticated the mask, it could not hide a grim reality. As Klein Moretti stepped into the ranks of demigods, he was no longer just facing external enemies. The greatest enemy now lay within his own flesh and blood, in every nerve cell gradually being replaced by the coldness of divinity. He was no longer just a man performing a play, but a soul trying not to be swallowed by the maddening greatness of his own existence. Part 4. Divinity versus Humanity. As a demigod, the world in Klein's eyes changed completely, revealing strands of fate and abstract laws. But the price was the erosion of emotion. Divinity is like a pitch-black ocean, always waiting to drown the tiny candle of humanity. The pinnacle of this challenge was the confrontation with Amon, the Angel of Time. Amon is the embodiment of pure divinity, brilliant, logical, but completely devoid of empathy. Amon did not understand why Klein suffered for tiny humans, or why he clung to trivial memories of a meal. Their battle was not just a display of supernatural powers, but a debate over the definition of existence. To win, Klein had to make a mad choice. He was willing to let the Lord of the Mysteries, celestial worthy, awaken in his body, willing to destroy himself to protect the world. This was the moment his growth reached full maturity. Klein realized he was not a messianic god. He was just an ordinary human, doing everything to keep the world from collapsing. In psychology, power is proportional to madness. To avoid becoming a second Amon, Klein clung to the most human anchors. He bore a messiah complex as tens of thousands of souls saw him as their only hope. Yet Klein felt humble, transforming personal fear into communal responsibility. He chose humanism over Amon's cold nihilism. The mechanism of anchoring was his rebellion against divinity. Klein, keeping in touch with the Tarot Club and caring about the lives of each member, was his way of reminding himself of his humanness. According to psychology, he reached the highest stage of moral development. self-sacrifice for a universal principle, the existence of humanity. Finally, he had to face the shadow of God, the awakening of the celestial worthy within him, learning to coexist with that darkness without being assimilated. When the roar of supernatural powers faded, when the enemy's monocle shattered, the world did not welcome a victorious God in glory. All that remained was a suffocating silence. Klein Moretti had reached the end of the road of power, but that peak was not a throne to rule, but a voluntary grave to protect. This is when we no longer see a transmigrator looking for a way back, but a nighthawk smiling goodbye. Part 5. The Sleep of Salvation, the Pinnacle of Growth. The final battle ended with a trade-off. To prevent the celestial worthy from awakening and wiping out humanity, Klein chose to fall into a deep sleep to face that entity directly in the spiritual world. Looking back at his journey, from Zhou Mingrui, who just wanted a hot meal on Earth, to Klein Moretti willing to sacrifice his own existence, he had truly found home. Home was no longer a distant coordinate in the 21st century. It was this steam-filled world, the place where the brothers, teammates, and strangers he swore to protect resided. In that long sleep, Klein finally shed all his masks. He was no longer a detective, a hunter, or a majestic god. He was simply himself, a tired but peaceful soul. He sleeps so the world can wake. He is lonely so humanity can gather. From a psychological perspective, this is perfect self-actualization. He overcame the fear of void, accepting his fate to fulfill his life's value through the unification of the self. Every action he took now sprang from pure will. At the same time, it was a great spiritual reconciliation of the concept of home. He realized Earth was the past, while home was where current soul connections resided. True growth is when we stop asking, "What does the world give me?" and start asking, "What can I leave for the world?" Finally, legacy and immortality in the minds of others. Though he sleeps, he lives on through the actions of those who carry his ideals in the Tarot Club. He conquered the absolute loneliness of divinity with a sustainable network of humanity. The journey of Klein Moretti is not just a story of magic or divine power. It is a mirror reflecting our own journey in life, from initial fear and painful stumbles to wearing masks to adapt, and finally, finding an ideal to commit to. We may not face mad gods, but every day we fight the madness of pressure, loneliness, and moral choices. And if one day you feel lost, remember the young man who chose to sleep soundly, so the light of humanity could always burn bright. Thank you for joining us on this journey to decode the psychology of Mr. Fool, Klein